December 20th, 1943, nearly 5.5 miles above Bremen, Germany. The leather glove on Second Lieutenant Charles Brown's hand trembled as it gripped the control column, his eyes fixed on engine number 2, now belching thick black smoke across the frozen German sky like some terrible wound. Outside the cockpit, the temperature had plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Inside his oxygen mask, Brown's breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps as he fought to maintain level flight with his crippled B-17 flying fortress. The shattered plexiglass nose of the cockpit offered no protection from the wind screaming through at 135 miles per hour, a sound like nothing else on Earth. What the 21-year-old Charlie Brown couldn't have imagined at that moment was what would happen in the next 30 minutes. An encounter with a German fighter ace was about to unfold, one that would challenge everything military doctrine held to be true in 1943. It would prove that enemies could sometimes choose humanity over orders, that honor might transcend the boundaries of nationality, that a single choice made in the freezing sky above Germany could prove more powerful than any weapon either nation had brought to the war. The events that would unfold over the following hour remained hidden away for decades, kept secret by authorities on both sides who recognized that revealing such an incident would undermine the simple narrative of good versus evil that nations at war require. Yet when the truth finally surfaced, 47 years later, it would emerge as one of the most remarkable acts of mercy ever recorded in military history. That morning, Brown had awakened at RAF Kimbolton in England. He was a farm boy from West Virginia, about to command his first combat mission. At just 21 years old, he bore responsibility for the lives of 9 other young men and a 4-engine bomber worth $240,000. Most of his crew hadn't yet reached their 20s. Each one was a trained specialist, months of preparation behind every role he filled. Together they flew a B-17 they had named Year Older Pub, with its name painted proudly across the nose alongside an image of a frothy beer mug. The morning briefing had been stark and terrifying in its clarity. Nearly 500 B-17s from the 8th Air Force would be striking the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory in Bremen, located deep in northern Germany. This factory was responsible for producing some of the Luftwaffe's most dangerous fighters, and German command would fight with everything they had to protect it. Intelligence reports indicated the target bristled with 250 anti-aircraft guns, arranged in rings around the city's perimeter. Hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters from multiple Jagdstaffels were expected to rise up to meet them. The briefing officer had been blunt and direct. Heavy resistance was guaranteed, casualties were inevitable. Some crews would not be coming back. Brown's crew received orders placing them in the most vulnerable position of the formation, the outer flank where German fighters habitually concentrated their assault. Single bombers in this exposed position rarely survived coordinated fighter attacks. The experienced pilots had a name for it: Coffin Corner. The younger crews simply exchanged pale looks and said nothing at all. The crossing over the North Sea had been brutal beyond words. Ice accumulated on wings and windscreens. Temperatures kept dropping as they climbed toward bombing altitude. Before they even reached Germany, 3 bombers had already turned back with mechanical failures, forcing the formation to tighten. Brown's aircraft moved forward into an even more exposed position. Things began to fall apart during the bomb run itself. As Year Older Pub started its long 10-minute approach, anti-aircraft fire erupted all around them like deadly black flowers blooming with crimson centers. The first shell struck directly ahead of the aircraft, obliterating the plexiglass nose and driving shrapnel through the forward compartment like shrapnel through flesh. The concussion killed engine number 2 instantly and damaged engine number 4, which began overspeeding dangerously. Brown wrestled with the controls as the bomber slowed, unable to keep pace with the formation. The other B-17s pulled steadily ahead, their shapes fading into the distance until they vanished entirely. Year Older Pub fell back, now alone, a wounded creature separated from the protection of the flock. That was when the predators arrived. At least 12 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 11 swarmed the stricken bomber. For more than 10 minutes they attacked in successive waves. Brown did what he could, the only thing he could do. He turned the bomber into each attack, using his remaining forward guns to disrupt their firing angles. This defensive maneuver kept them barely alive, but damage accumulated with horrifying speed. Engine number 3 took multiple hits that reduced it to half power. The bomber now operated at roughly 40% of its total available power. The oxygen system ruptured completely, and both Brown and his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Spencer Hank Luco, lost consciousness. At 27,000 feet without oxygen, they possessed only minutes before death became inevitable. The bomber began its descent. Ye Olde Pub spiraled downward through the freezing air, plunging toward the frozen German countryside far below. At 3,000 feet, barely above the rooftops of Oldenburg, Brown's eyes opened. His consciousness returned at the last possible moment. Training took over instinctively. He hauled back on the control column with every remaining ounce of strength, and impossibly, the bomber leveled out. They had descended so low that Brown could see the shock written across the faces of German civilians, watching from below as an American bomber passed overhead at rooftop height, close enough that its wings nearly sheared tiles from their homes. Brown assessed the damage, and his stomach dropped into his boots. The hydraulic system had been destroyed, meaning no flaps, no brakes, landing gear would have to be deployed manually. The electrical system barely functioned at all. Half the rudder had been shot clean away. The entire tail section hung in tatters, resembling Swiss cheese. The horizontal stabilizer bore so many impacts, it seemed miraculous it still provided any control authority. 10 of the bomber's 11 defensive guns had frozen solid or been destroyed outright. Only the top turret guns and a single nose gun remained functional, leaving them nearly defenseless. The nose compartment had been completely blown open. The plexiglass bombardier section had shattered into fragments, creating a howling wind tunnel that made speaking nearly impossible and threatened to tear loose anything not bolted down. Shell fragments had punctured the fuel tanks. Hydraulic fluids streamed from severed lines, freezing into glittering crystals in the -40-degree air. Control cables had been cut and held together only by the thinnest remaining strands. Back in the tail section, Sergeant Hugh Eckie Eckert lay dead at his position, killed instantly by a 20mm cannon shell. Other crew members bore severe wounds. Tail gunner Alexander Spanker had taken shrapnel tearing into his leg and shoulder. Ball turret gunner Sam Blackford had lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation and had to be physically removed from his cramped position. Every member of the crew suffered from frostbite setting in, fingers and faces turning white in the brutal sub-zero temperatures. Oxygen deprivation left several men confused and struggling to think clearly. Brown's own shoulder throbbed with pain where metal had torn through his flight jacket. He could feel blood soaking through his shirt, but there was nothing he could do about it now. His co-pilot, Hank Luco, bore similar wounds, hurt but still functional. Flying was all that mattered now. Brown offered his crew a choice. Bailing out meant becoming prisoners of war, but that was preferable to dying inside a doomed aircraft. Not a single man refused. They would fly home together, or they would perish together. The crippled bomber limped northward at 135 miles per hour, streaming smoke and hydraulic fluid behind it like a dying creature dragging itself forward. 250 miles of open North Sea lay between them and England. Brown knew their odds were virtually non-existent, but they flew on regardless. He didn't know that their flight path had carried them directly over a Luftwaffe airfield near the town of Jever, and at that very airfield, a fighter pilot was refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt 9. At 28 years old, Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler was about to make the most significant decision of his entire life. Franz Stiegler had been born on August 21, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria, into a family where aviation ran deeper than blood itself. His father had been a pilot during the First World War, flying reconnaissance missions above the Western Front. From his earliest years, Franz had absorbed aviation the way other children absorbed stories. By age 12, he was already piloting gliders in the hills surrounding Regensburg, learning to read wind and sky with an instinct that would protect him in the years ahead. By 1933, at just 18 years old, he was flying powered aircraft with a natural talent that marked him immediately. Before war erupted, he had been selected for Deutsche Lufthansa, the precursor to the modern Lufthansa, where he flew as a commercial airline pilot. Such a position was available only to the most exceptional aviators. He flew passenger routes across Europe, accumulating thousands of hours at the controls and developing the smooth, exact precision that would define his combat flying years later. When war began in 1939, Stigler faced a choice. Commercial pilots could remain exempt from military service because their skills were essential to transport operations. He could have stayed safe. Instead, he volunteered to serve. When Stigler joined the Luftwaffe in 1940, his extensive experience meant he initially served as an instructor pilot, teaching new recruits the fundamentals of military aviation. Among his pupils was a young pilot named Gerhard Barkhorn, who would eventually shoot down more than 300 aircraft and rank among history's highest-scoring aces. Yet Stigler wanted combat for himself. Instruction was valuable, but he believed he could accomplish more at the front lines. He requested a transfer to a fighter squadron. In 1942, his wish was granted. He was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 27 and deployed to North Africa, where Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps battled the British Eighth Army across the deserts of Libya and Tunisia. Under the command of the legendary Eduard Neumann, Stigler honed his craft under the harshest imaginable conditions. He flew alongside some of Germany's greatest aces. The desert was a harsh teacher that showed no mercy. Engine failure meant death in sand. Navigation mistakes meant vanishing without a trace. Yet it was also a place where certain codes of conduct still existed. British and German pilots might exchange gunfire in the morning, then share a drink that evening after one had been captured. Unwritten rules governed everything. One moment in North Africa would shape everything that came afterward. Stigler's squadron commander, Gustav Rödel, who had flown with distinction since the Battle of Britain, assembled his pilots for what appeared to be a routine briefing. But Rödel's words carried extraordinary weight. "You are fighter pilots first and last, always," he had stated, his voice hard as iron. "If I ever see or hear of any man shooting at someone in a parachute, I will shoot that man myself." The meaning was unmistakable. Even in war, there were boundaries. There existed lines that honorable men refused to cross. A pilot descending by parachute was utterly defenseless, helpless. To kill such a man was murder, nothing less. Stigler absorbed those words completely. By December 1943, Stigler had returned to Germany after the Afrika Korps collapsed. His record showed 27 confirmed victories, bringing him close to the threshold needed for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military decorations. For a fighter pilot, such a medal represented everything. Recognition, honor, proof of duty fulfilled. It symbolized survival when so many others had fallen. On this morning of December 20th, Stigler had already shot down 2 B-17s. One additional bomber would bring him closer to that Knight's Cross. Stigler remained on the ground when he heard the unmistakable sound of American engines straining overhead. His Messerschmitt 109 was being refueled and rearmed. The aircraft carried a .50 caliber bullet lodged in its radiator from that morning's fighting, threatening engine overheating. But when Stigler glimpsed the wounded B-17 passing low overhead, trailing smoke behind it, he made his choice instantly. He sprinted toward his fighter and took off. Stigler caught up with Ye Olde Pub in less than 2 minutes. He maneuvered to the bomber's rear, positioning himself in the classic attack position. His finger moved toward the firing button. This was the moment, the easy victory. Another step toward his Knight's Cross, the culmination of everything he had fought to achieve. Then he observed what lay inside the bomber. Through the massive holes torn open by cannon shells, he could see everything clearly. He saw the dead tail gunner slumped over his weapons. He saw crew members drenched in blood, desperately working to aid their injured comrades. He saw the pilot hunched forward over the controls, fighting with every ounce of strength to keep the shattered aircraft airborne. The bomber's tail hung in tatters. The nose section had been obliterated. The aircraft bore so many perforations that Stigler could see straight through from one side to the opposite side. The fact that this plane remained flying at all seemed beyond possibility. Stigler moved closer still, flying alongside the bomber's right wing, near enough to observe individual rivets and the ragged edges of torn metal. He could now see the pilot's face through the broken cockpit window. A young man, possibly even younger than Stigler himself, with fear and fierce determination etched across his features. The pilot's hands gripped the control column so hard his knuckles had turned white. Blood stained his flight jacket. For a moment, stretching into what felt like eternity, Stigler's finger hovered above the firing button. One pressure and everything would end in seconds. The bomber would drop from the sky, 9 Americans would perish, but they were essentially dead men already anyway. This ruined wreckage could never successfully cross the North Sea. He would be providing mercy, allowing a quick end rather than forcing them to endure freezing water or burning as fuel tanks ignited. One victory would be his. One more step toward the recognition he had earned fighting for 2 relentless years. Then Gustav Rödel's voice sounded in his memory, as vivid as if his commander occupied the cockpit beside him. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Stigler looked at the dying bomber and its wounded crew and suddenly understood something that transformed everything. They weren't descending by parachute, not yet anyway, but they were defenseless nonetheless. Helpless, that's what they were. They represented no danger to Germany, not to his fellow pilots, not to a single soul. Almost every weapon they carried had been ruined, locked in a freeze that gripped the upper atmosphere. The few firearms still working were managed by men torn up from battle, so exhausted they kept slipping into unconsciousness. All they wanted was to breathe another day, to get back to their families, to rescue whoever they could from their crew. This wasn't warfare anymore. Not in any traditional sense. It had transformed into something wholly different. Like they were suspended beneath a parachute, someone would hear Stigler say years later when recounting this moment. "I watched them and my finger wouldn't move toward the trigger. Pulling that trigger would have been cold-blooded killing, not an act of war." In that single moment, Franz Stigler faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He picked honor instead of medals, human decency instead of obedience. The chance to live over the order to kill, what his conscience demanded over what his superiors commanded. Yet Stigler went further than simply choosing not to attack. In a split-second decision that shattered every rule of military engagement and put everything he had at stake, he chose to do something extraordinary. He would protect them. Spencer, Luke, and Brown, the pilot and co-pilot, watched with alarm as the German plane maneuvered alongside them on the starboard side, hovering just a few feet from their wingtip. This was it, they believed. The finish. The fighter jet would obliterate them at this distance, where missing would be impossible. They had no warning, no chance. Shells from the cannon would pierce straight through the fuselage. Everything would end in an instant, a burning explosion plummeting toward the ground below. The German plane didn't unleash its weapons, though. Rather, he gestured wildly, his hand moving back and forth, pointing downward then sideways. Stigler was attempting to convey a message, yet between the roar of wind pouring through the broken glass of the cockpit, with engines gasping and choking, with most of the team barely hanging on due to injuries and lack of oxygen, Brown couldn't decipher his meaning. The Germans seemed to be saying they should set down immediately, hand over their aircraft on enemy ground. Brown shook his head firmly. Surrender wasn't an option. His people would continue until the very end. They would crash into the water if necessary, but capitulation was unthinkable. Stigler persisted, this time aiming his fingers toward the north, in the direction of Sweden and safety outside of war zones. The intention became obvious. Neutral Sweden lay closer than their destination across the channel, roughly 150 miles as opposed to 250. If they turned that direction at this moment, they would sit confined there through the war's end, though they would continue breathing. They would get medicine for their injuries, their wounded could be treated properly. They would spend the conflict in peace before returning to their loved ones. The opportunity before them seemed unique, perhaps their sole opportunity to make it through. Brown either didn't grasp the message or chose not to accept it. He held the aircraft's nose northward, toward England, toward the people waiting for them, toward the oath he had taken. Either they would arrive home or they would perish in the effort. Stigler realized the Americans weren't interpreting his communication, or they were deliberately refusing. And he recognized something that gripped him with terror. This crippled aircraft, dragging itself across the heavens at barely above 130 miles per hour, at heights less than 1,000 feet, was approaching Germany's fortified perimeter. This fortified strip held innumerable gun emplacements arranged in interlocking patterns, engineered specifically to obliterate aircraft flying this slowly and this low. The operators manning these positions ranked among Germany's most skilled gunners, veterans who had spent years targeting American bombers. They could eliminate a target moving this sluggishly and sitting this low without conscious effort. In the state it was in, bleeding smoke and fluid, flying straight and unchanging because it couldn't maneuver otherwise, this old bomber would disintegrate in less than half a minute beneath those guns. The aircraft would be shredded before the water came into view. Stigler understood he required yet another decision that defied every principle of military protocol, one that made his previous actions appear almost conventional by contrast. He steered his fighter to the left side of the damaged aircraft, positioning himself with terrifying closeness, so near that Brown could make out each feature of the German pilot's expression beyond the transparent canopy, with just a short distance separating their wingtips. Mere feet meant that even slight fluctuations, even the tiniest navigational slip, even momentary distraction would lead to a catastrophic impact, a collision at high velocity that would end everyone aboard. Stigler turned his gaze across toward Brown. The two men gazed at one another for what stretched into an eternity of seconds. Then Stigler performed an action that transformed everything. He rendered a salute, a proper military gesture, rendered with the formality exchanged between individuals of matching authority, a recognition of dignity, of understanding, of one skilled combatant honoring another, conveying, "I recognize your struggle, I comprehend your objective to preserve your personnel, I celebrate that determination." What came next exceeded even this. Stigler maintained his position beside the bomber, holding altitude with the accuracy of a precision aerobatics competitor. The German gunners below had been schooled to engage anything that fell inside their range, responding without hesitation or confirmation. Standing instructions were absolute. Anything that rises into the atmosphere, anything that descends low, anything that appears over Reich territory, eliminate it. Nothing was exempt. Countless American aircraft had been destroyed by these weapons. The gunners had experience stretching back years, their accuracy nearly flawless. Yet these same gunners understood how to recognize their own machines. They could identify the Messerschmitt 109 by sight. They comprehended the patterns of legitimate German formations. They understood the emblems and call identifications of their squadrons. When they observed a Messerschmitt 109 traveling alongside a bomber in extraordinarily tight formation, the aircraft appearing almost as a single entity, their training created an alternative understanding, contrary to their standard protocols. This resembled a captured American plane being transported to a German airbase, perhaps a German aircraft coming back from experimental testing, perhaps a classified operation without prior notice. Whatever the explanation, a German fighter flying nearby implied restraint. Stigler transformed himself into a barrier against attack. He subjected himself to danger, confronted the possibility of friendly fire if those below recognized the bomber as American, all to defend an enemy aircraft. He confronted the prospect of court-martial and execution if his actions were discovered. He exposed himself to the possibility of a mid-air crash, given that the bomber's pilot could take an abrupt action. He endangered his capacity to reach land again by consuming fuel over hostile waters, with no guarantee of return. Throughout more than a quarter hour, the duration required for a bomber moving at 135 mph to traverse the coast's defenses, he maintained formation with the deteriorating aircraft. Such precision maneuvering demanded absolute concentration. Any lapse, any shift in attention, any momentary loss of focus meant destruction for all persons aboard. He retained his relative position amid wind shear, amid the bomber's unpredictable movements as its compromised hydraulics produced abnormal reactions, amid the pull to observe the gunners beneath, who certainly watched this peculiar configuration transit overhead. They traveled above Wilhelmshaven, crossing the submarine facilities and maritime installations. They crossed over artillery positions capable of obliterating both planes instantly. They traversed above German settlements where residents glanced upward in bewilderment at an American bomber flanked by a German interceptor, confusion written across their expressions. All across Germany's heavily fortified coastline, across the lethal perimeter, continuing till they entered international waters and protection. Brown remained largely bewildered. The German aircraft clung to their position. Was he positioning them for destruction? Was this a calculated deception? Brown instructed the man in the Top Gun turret to track the German plane, keeping weapons ready but not engaging. Stiegler noticed the weapons targeting him. He comprehended the signal. The Americans maintained their wariness, yet it made no difference now. The threatening guns lay behind them. They had gained their reprieve. Stiegler separated from the bomber. He faced Brown across the distance one final moment. Then he extended his arm in one ultimate gesture of respect, banked his aircraft sharply, and headed back in the direction of Germany. Brown observed as the German interceptor disappeared among the clouds, became unrecognizable, then faded completely. His consciousness struggled to process the events. An adversary in the sky, an opponent in uniform whose mission was destroying Americans, had just extended his protection. Beyond merely declining to assault them, he had personally conducted them to sanctuary, endangering his own existence to do so. The comprehension contradicted everything taught to them. All the briefings, all the posters condemning the opposition, all the motion pictures depicted the adversary as ruthless, without conscience. But this German had demonstrated nothing save compassion. It contradicted the entire foundation of what they were told. Yet consideration became academic. They remained many miles from safety across turbulent northern waters, and the possibility of reaching home remained microscopic. With 3 power plants damaged beyond functioning, with the entire construction preserved by fortune and a handful of unbroken mechanical connections, the aircraft descended progressively, relentlessly. The personnel labored uncontrollably to keep existence possible. They discarded all removable cargo to minimize heaviness. Ammunition cartridges went overboard initially, followed by the ammunition within them, thousands of projectiles descending into the depths. The cannons themselves departed, yanked free and ejected through the fractured windows. Belongings, supplies, personal items, all weight-bearing goods. The structure became essentially vacant. The flight specialist revised the direction multiple instances, seeking the most efficient path toward base while calculating side-wind influence despite minimal functioning navigation systems. The communication specialist labored desperately trying to establish transmission contact, though the compromised electrical network meant he could only capture fragments of received signals. They journeyed solo through emptiness, unheard, undetected, competing for each remaining hour. Throughout 4 hours, stretching across what seemed like quadruple the period, Brown battled the airplane's controls. His injured arm screamed at each manipulation, discomfort intensifying as shock subsided and frigidity grabbed hold. His digits ached beneath protective gloves. His facial tissue appeared pallid and hardened with frost damage. His awareness grew muddled from oxygen scarcity and depletion. Yet determination alone kept the aircraft ascending, executing perpetual micro-modifications to stabilize the wings, sustain elevation, preserve the combustion. The northern waterway in December represented among Earth's most treacherous territories. Tempests perpetually swept the murky expanse. Vision deteriorated to near invisibility. Temperature could eliminate existence in merely moments. Should they drop into that water, should mechanical failure or structural collapse occur, they possessed perhaps 120 seconds before hypothermia rendered recovery unviable, and nobody would salvage them regardless. The wider world remained ignorant of their position. Nobody maintained search efforts. Hours prior, they had been recorded as lost. Yet miraculously, the battered machine sustained flight. The primary motor, the exclusive engine performing at complete capability, persisted in operation. The tertiary engine, compromised but functional, supplied supplementary propulsion. The quaternary motor, growing perilously hot and vibrating with extreme danger, maintained function despite expectations of catastrophic breakdown. Ultimately, following what stretched into eternity, the shoreline of Great Britain emerged from the cloud cover. Brown possessed complete disorientation regarding their specific situation. Reception capability had ceased. Guidance instruments had been eliminated. The directional instrument proved unreliable because of the extensive structural harm. He simply scanned for any landing location, any suitable terrain adequate for settling a failing machine. Then it became visible. RAF seething, the 448th Bomber Unit's assigned facility. That concrete stretch below promised deliverance. Brown commenced the descent, although complications persisted. The hydraulic mechanism had failed, necessitating manual operation of the landing apparatus. 2 personnel cranked the mechanical handle continually, rotating hundreds of iterations to extend the undercarriage. The horizontal surfaces for descent speed reduction refused to activate whatsoever. Their velocity would exceed acceptable parameters, striking the surface at approximately 140 mph instead of the standard 90. Stopping mechanisms would depend upon friction alone, with uncertain functionality. The wind current pushed them sideways. Brown countered, although his authority felt unresponsive, postponed, owing to the destroyed connection systems. The aircraft descended. Brown struggled, preserving balance. Touchdown arrived abruptly, powerful, the most intense contact Brown had ever encountered during landing. The complete aircraft convulsed. The undercarriage exploded with a sickening crack that reverberated through the entire fuselage. The bomber lurched upward, climbing 20 feet into the air before gravity reasserted its grip. For a suspended moment, they hung there, weightless and helpless. Then they plummeted back down, metal screaming against tarmac. This time the wheels held. They were rolling now, skidding sideways across the runway, but they were down. Brown's foot pressed hard on the mechanical brakes, muscles straining against the pedals. The aircraft decelerated, but the runway was disappearing fast. The end of the tarmac raced toward them. They weren't going to stop in time. There was nothing more to do. The bomber left the runway and dropped onto grass, still moving with lethal momentum. It bounced and shuddered violently, then slid into a muddy field and finally, mercifully, came to rest. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They sat frozen in their seats, hardly daring to breathe. Then Brown's hand reached for the engine switches. One by one, he killed them. The roar that had defined the last hours of their lives cut off instantly, leaving only an overwhelming, almost painful silence. After the constant thunder of engines and wind screaming past the fuselage, the quiet felt wrong, unnatural, impossible. The crew remained motionless, stunned beyond words. They were alive. They were on the ground. They were home. None of it seemed real. When the hatches wouldn't open, when they realized the normal exits were jammed or twisted beyond use, the crew improvised. They climbed out through the holes in the skin of the aircraft, gripping twisted metal edges with their hands, pulling themselves through openings that shouldn't have existed. As their feet touched solid ground, they saw what their aircraft had become. Ground personnel were already running toward them from every direction, mechanics and flight officers drawn by the impossible sight before them. They slowed as they approached, then stopped completely, unable to process what they were seeing. The bomber was barely recognizable as an aircraft anymore. Maintenance crews walked around it in stunned silence, their eyes tracing the devastation. They began to count. 20, 30, 50 holes, 100, 200. They kept counting. By the time they finished, they had tallied more than 400 bullet and shell holes tearing through the fuselage. Tiny perforations from machine gun fire pocked the skin everywhere. But mixed among these were massive tears, jagged wounds from cannon shells 20 and 30 millimeters across. You could stand at one side of the aircraft and look straight through to daylight on the other. The fuselage looked like Swiss cheese. The tail section hung from the main body by barely more than a thread of structural steel. A few remaining members held it in place, connections that should have separated and snapped miles ago over Germany. The nose was completely obliterated, just a ragged opening where plexiglass and aluminum had been shredded away. 3 of the 4 engines were destroyed or hanging like twisted metal sculptures, useless scrap. The wings were so riddled with holes that they resembled lace more than flight surfaces. The fact that these damaged wings had supported the aircraft's weight at all seemed to violate every law of physics. A veteran maintenance officer, a man who had examined hundreds of damaged bombers, and had become numb to the horrors of combat, stood speechless. He had never, in his entire career, seen an aircraft this badly damaged, still capable of flight. Another officer shook his head slowly and spoke the thought aloud. According to every principle of aerodynamics, according to probability and physics and reason itself, this aircraft should have plummeted from the sky somewhere over Germany. That anyone had survived was simply impossible. A third officer, standing apart from the others, offered his own conclusion. He said that God must have been at the controls with that pilot, because no human being could have brought this wreck home alive. Inside a cold office, intelligence officers sat across from Brown with notebooks open, ready for another account of another mission. They had heard countless combat stories, and they listened with the detachment of men recording facts rather than drama. Brown told them everything. The flak, the damage, the German fighters coming at them from every angle, the desperate dive toward the ground, the moment when he somehow pulled the dying aircraft back from certain doom at 3,000 feet. He described the destruction of engines, the loss of men, the frantic flight northward toward the coast. And then he said something that stopped the officers mid-sentence. He described a German pilot, not an enemy who attacked them, but one who had escorted them to safety. The officers looked up from their notebooks, pens suspended in air. Brown described how the German fighter had positioned itself between their wounded bomber and the anti-aircraft batteries below. He described how the enemy pilot had saluted them, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. He described how this German had risked his own aircraft to shield them from fire. He described how the German pilot had violated his orders, had betrayed his superiors, had committed an act that could be prosecuted as treason under Nazi law, all to save 10 American airmen he had never met. The room fell into complete silence. The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to process what they were hearing. Then the ranking officer closed his notebook deliberately and made a decision that would echo through the decades. This incident was classified immediately. Secret. No exceptions. Not a word to other crews, not to families, not to friends, not to anyone at all. The classification would endure indefinitely. Any breach would result in court-martial. The reasoning was strategic and ruthless. The story of a German pilot capable of mercy, of conscience, of humanity, could undermine the war effort. It might plant seeds of doubt in Allied aircrews. It might make them hesitate in combat. It might encourage them to search for mercy from an enemy known for cruelty and slaughter. In total war, such complications had no place. The message had to remain clean and uncomplicated. Us against them, good against evil, democracy against fascism. There could be no grey areas, no enemy with a heart, no German capable of anything but fanaticism and murder. The official explanation was delivered with chilling certainty. You cannot be human and fly for the German Luftwaffe. They are all Nazis. All of them are fanatics. All of them are killers. What you experienced was an anomaly, possibly a trick, an attempted deception. You will not speak of it. You will not dwell on it. You will not permit it to influence how you conduct this war. Brown signed the classification document. He understood the logic, even as it twisted something inside him. He had witnessed what he had witnessed. He knew what he knew, but he would remain silent. He flew more missions, lost more friends, watched more bombers spiral down from the sky with smoke pouring from their engines. When the war finally ended, he returned to West Virginia. The transition to civilian life was harder than he expected. The memories wouldn't leave him. He enrolled in college on the GI Bill, earned his degree, tried to build something normal. But in 1949, unable to fully separate himself from military service, he returned to the newly formed Air Force. He worked in special investigations, ironically hunting down Nazi war criminals. He served with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, planning strategy for a Cold War that was already beginning to define the world. Assignments accumulated over 2 decades, promotions came, life moved forward through all the ordinary passages. Marriage, children, houses, careers. But through all of it, one memory remained vivid and inescapable. The Messerschmitt. The salute. The impossible gesture of mercy in a sky filled with death. He wondered about the German pilot constantly. Had he survived? Was he alive somewhere? Did he ever think about that December day? Brown retired in 1972 with the rank of lieutenant colonel, but he never retired from the question that haunted him. Thousands of miles away, Franz Stiegler landed his fighter near Bremen and faced a decision that would define everything that came after. He said nothing. Not to his squadron mates, who would have called him a traitor. Not to his officers, who would have ordered his execution. Not to his family, whose survival would have been endangered by the knowledge. Not to anyone, ever. The reason was both simple and terrible. Under Nazi military law, interpreted by increasingly paranoid and vicious authorities in late 1943, what Stiegler had committed was a capital crime. He had permitted an enemy aircraft to escape when destruction was possible. He had actively protected enemy personnel. He had jeopardized his own aircraft to shield them from fire. Any one of these actions could be prosecuted as treason, or cowardice, or defeatism. Together, they constituted an undeniable case for execution. The Nazi regime had grown progressively more brutal in its purges of the disloyal. Officers had been shot for minor infractions. Pilots who aborted missions due to mechanical failure were sometimes accused of cowardice. Men who expressed doubt about final victory were arrested in the middle of the night by the Gestapo. In this atmosphere of terror and suspicion, Stiegler's act of compassion would have been viewed as the ultimate betrayal. If anyone had discovered what he did, he would have been arrested within hours. The Gestapo would have torn through his life. They would have interrogated his family, his friends, his squadron mates, searching for evidence of defeatism or disloyalty. The investigation alone would have destroyed everyone around him, even if somehow he escaped the firing squad. So he remained silent. He buried the memory deep, far below the surface, where no one could reach it. He never claimed the bomber as a kill, though no one would have questioned it. He never wrote about it in his diary. He sealed it away completely and continued flying. Mission after mission, day after day, he pretended it had never happened. But something essential had shifted inside him. He continued flying combat sorties. He continued engaging Allied aircraft in the air. He continued performing his duties as a fighter pilot. But the hunger was gone. The enthusiasm for victories, for the Knight's Cross that had seemed so important that morning, had evaporated. Now he flew to protect his comrades, to defend German skies, to fulfill his obligations. The thrill had been replaced by exhaustion and a creeping awareness that Germany's fate was sealed, that this war would not end well, that all of this blood and sacrifice was leading only toward darkness. Stiegler flew 487 combat missions. The number was almost incomprehensible. Nearly 3 years of continuous combat flying, mission after mission, combat after combat, without reprieve. He was shot down 17 times, brought down again and again, yet somehow always survived. 6 times he bailed out, parachuting into German territory and returning to duty. 11 times he crash-landed his disabled aircraft, walking away from impacts that should have killed him. In the final months of the war, he transitioned to the Messerschmitt 262, the revolutionary jet fighter that represented German technological innovation at its peak. He flew with Jagdverband 44, an elite unit commanded by Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest aces. Jets against propeller-driven aircraft should have been a slaughter. But by then the Allies had achieved such overwhelming numerical superiority that even technological superiority could not alter the outcome. Stiegler flew until the very end, bringing his jet down onto damaged autobahns as German airbases were overrun and captured. He fought in an increasingly desperate battle against impossible odds. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Stiegler had accumulated 27 confirmed victories, though the true count was certainly higher. Countless combats went unwitnessed. Countless victories unclaimed. After that December day, when he had chosen mercy, he had simply lost interest in claiming kills. He landed his jet for the last time and stepped out into a Germany he barely recognized. The country lay in ruins, both physically and spiritually. His brother August, also a pilot, had been killed in 1940 when his Junkers crashed over France during a bombing mission against Britain. August had been only 24. Stiegler was now the last male of his immediate family, the sole survivor of a war that had consumed millions. The cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. but the physical destruction paled compared to the moral catastrophe that emerged. The concentration camps were being liberated, the full scale of the Holocaust was being revealed. The regime Stigler had served, however reluctantly in those final years, stood exposed as one of history's greatest evils. Like countless German veterans, Stigler faced a terrible reckoning. He had fought for Germany, for his homeland, for his comrades. He had never joined the Nazi Party. He had never personally committed war crimes. But he had served the regime. He had helped defend it. He had shot down Allied pilots who were fighting to destroy that evil. The moral weight was crushing, inescapable, insoluble. In 1953, unable to construct a future in a devastated and divided Germany, Stigler made a difficult choice. He emigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia. He built a business from nothing, working 18-hour days to establish himself in a foreign land. He learned English, he married, he raised a family. He became a Canadian citizen. He tried to leave the war behind entirely, to build something new, to forget the past and all its terrible complexity. But one memory remained with him always, sharp and vivid and impossible to suppress. The memory of a December day in 1943 when he had made a choice that revealed who he truly was. The memory of a crippled bomber struggling toward the sea, wounded men fighting to survive, a young pilot determined to save his crew, a decision to choose compassion over obedience, humanity over orders, conscience over career. The memory of a salute. Stigler never spoke of it, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone, not for decades. The secret sat inside him like a stone, heavy and unchanging. He wondered endlessly what had happened to that bomber crew. Had they made it across the North Sea? Had they survived the war? Did they remember him, or did they believe it had been some kind of trap, some elaborate German deception? Brown built his life in Miami, Florida, working in environmental and energy research. He built a home, he raised children. He tried to move forward and forget the war, but it never quite released its grip on him. The memory of the salute stayed with him always. Stigler built his life in Vancouver, growing his business, raising his family, trying to leave the war behind. But that same memory remained with him, unchanging and inescapable. They lived on opposite sides of a continent, separated by thousands of miles and decades of silence. They had no idea the other had survived. They had no idea the other was out there wondering the same questions, carrying the same memories, asking the same unanswerable questions. Brown didn't know if the German pilot had survived, had been shot down, had been executed for his mercy, or had simply vanished into the chaos of defeated Germany. Stigler didn't know if the bomber had crossed the North Sea, if the crew had lived, if his compassion had mattered or had been wasted on men who died minutes after he departed. They were bound together by an invisible thread, two men connected by 30 minutes in December 1943, yet separated by geography and circumstance, and the classification stamp on a military document, and the silence that both had kept for their own reasons. Then in 1986, 50 years after that December day, everything changed. Brown received an invitation to speak at the gathering of Eagles, a reunion of combat pilots at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. These were veterans of every combat theater, men who had flown in World War II and Korea and Vietnam, men who understood what combat aviation demanded. During a question-and-answer session following his prepared remarks, someone posed a question that would change everything. Had he experienced any particularly unforgettable missions during his service in World War II? Brown's body went rigid. He paused. A long silence stretched between him and the questioner. He had received explicit orders never to discuss what had happened that day. Even now, 4 decades and 3 years after the war ended, the incident remained technically classified. But Brown had transitioned to civilian life. He was retired now, removed from military hierarchy. The conflict itself had become history, something taught in textbooks. The vast majority of those who had stamped the security classification on this story were no longer alive. Their graves had been tended for years. The Soviet system was disintegrating before the world's eyes. The decades-long tension between superpowers was dissolving. What genuine danger could surface from revealing what truly transpired? More importantly, Brown had reached an age where he comprehended something vital. Certain stories possess an obligation to be shared. History belonged to humanity, not to filing cabinets and brass. There existed truths that transcended rubber stamps and command structures. After 43 years of enforced silence, Brown made his decision. He would finally speak. He recounted the encounter with the German pilot whose decision had preserved his existence. Every element emerged from memory: the unexpected gesture of respect, the formation flight, the deliberate choice to preserve rather than destroy. The room filled with former pilots and crew members, men whose lives had been forged in combat. These individuals had navigated through exploding ammunition, engaged in aerial duels, watched comrades perish, delivered lethal force. They comprehended the cold logic of air combat with intimate knowledge. As Brown's words flowed, some of these hardened warriors found tears streaming down their faces. Others maintained composure, expressions unreadable, wrestling internally with what they were processing. A handful displayed doubt, skepticism flickering across their features. Could memories truly be this clear? Could someone separated from a cataclysmic event by so many years maintain such precision? Could aging and psychological injury have reconstructed false details? During warfare of such magnitude, when civilization's survival hung suspended in genuine peril, could an adversary truly have chosen restraint? Could a German fighter pilot, representing perhaps history's most reprehensible regime, have possessed such profound compassion? Something shifted fundamentally in Brown after that speech. Understanding crystallized within him. He required resolution. After spending 43 years carrying this burden in isolation, wandering through life incomplete, he needed answers. This unknown aviator had gifted him an existence. Decades of marriage, children, a constructed life, grandchildren. He needed to express gratitude to the person whose mercy had rewritten his entire future. He needed closure, an answer to the question that had infiltrated his sleep for nearly 50 years. Brown commenced a pursuit that would consume 4 subsequent years. Letters departed to the United States Air Force Historical Office, requesting documentation from December 20, 1943. He initiated contact with German Federal Record repositories seeking Luftwaffe personnel rosters. He reached toward West German aviation branches, searching for information about pilots stationed in the Bremen vicinity. Veteran associations across both nations received his correspondence. He scrutinized mission documents, cross-referenced timelines. He examined how German fighter squadrons had been distributed, attempting to identify which units operated in that sector on that particular date. He reviewed photographs of German airfields, calculating which bases positioned fighters to intercept his bomber. He accumulated information methodically, but the answer remained elusive. Records from that December were fragmented. The relentless bombing campaign had obliterated numerous German archives. The warfare's chaotic final phase had destroyed additional documentation. What remained was incomplete, contradictory. Pilot designations were occasionally sealed away, frequently vanished entirely. Nobody retained memory of a fighter providing safe passage to a bomber. Brown's certainty wavered. His recollection of that day contained gaps. Injury, oxygen starvation, overwhelming terror, and exhaustion had clouded his mind. Perhaps the salute hadn't occurred. Perhaps there had been no escort. Perhaps the fighter had merely traveled parallel by happenstance, returning homeward. Perhaps his fractured consciousness had constructed comfort through fabrication, a narrative of compassion to counterbalance the devastation of witnessing comrades' deaths. His own proximity to annihilation, bringing a wounded aircraft home. Yet something deeper within him rejected this interpretation. The memory possessed clarity. The details remained crystalline, too specific, too vivid to be psychological construction. The salute transpired. The escort had been genuine. That mercy was absolutely authentic. Brown persisted. He had piloted a devastated aircraft across 250 miles of ocean. Surely he could sustain this investigation. He would search until discovery or definitive proof of futility. 1990 brought a decision. After 4 years of disappointment, Brown attempted a final strategy. He composed correspondence to combat crew, a newsletter reaching former Luftwaffe aviators. The message was straightforward. He documented the operation, the date, the region. He depicted his B-17, the destruction inflicted upon it. A bomber reconstructed by miracles, yet maintaining functionality. He recounted the fighter alongside him, the gesture of respect, the choice for clemency. He posed inquiry: "Do you possess this memory? Were you commanding that aircraft? Does anyone recognize this pilot?" The letter departed. Brown anticipated disappointment. 4 years of correspondence had yielded emptiness. Why should this attempt differ? Weeks converted to months. 4 turned to months of waiting, wrestling with restrained hopefulness, steeling against inevitable letdown. Then Vancouver dispatched an envelope northward. Brown's hands trembled. Careful handwriting conveyed 5 words that transformed everything. "I was that pilot." The letter bore Franz Stiegler's signature. Brown positioned the telephone call immediately. When Stiegler's voice emerged, Brown requested specifics. The German pilot remembered everything: the damaged aircraft, the escort formation, his position on the left wing, his black Messerschmitt, the salute as departure approached, each detail aligned precisely. Both warriors wept simultaneously through the receiver. 47 years had delivered them reunion. They arranged to meet in person. June 21, 1990, placed them face to face for the first occasion since that December afternoon in 1943. Their embrace resembled brothers separated by lifetime. Brown felt something release from within his chest. The recurring nightmares that had tormented his sleep for decades commenced their dissolution. He possessed answers to questions inhabiting his consciousness across 50 years. For Stiegler, validation arrived at last. His decision to preserve the bomber had been righteous. These individuals had lived completely. Families emerged, communities benefited from their contributions. His conscience had guided correctly, despite foregoing advancement toward the Knight's Cross, despite the possibility of court-martial and worse. The two developed brotherhood of unprecedented depth. Regular journeys connected Vancouver to Miami. Air exhibitions, reunions of veterans, historical presentations became their platforms. Their testimony reached audiences globally. Recognition arrived when the European Combatants Federation bestowed upon Stiegler the Star of Peace Award in 1993, honoring his mercy demonstrated 50 years previous. 2008 brought recognition for the complete crew. Each survivor of the cabin puff received the Silver Star in recognition of their battlefield courage. Brown himself accepted the Air Force Cross among America's supreme honors. Historians have exhaustively chronicled this encounter. Articles multiplied, volumes materialized, documentaries proliferated. Adam Marcos synthesized the definitive record in his 2012 publication, A Higher Call, which ascended the New York Times bestseller rankings. The Swedish metal ensemble Sabaton immortalized the moment through their composition, No Bullets Fly. Educational spaces employ this narrative to examine warfare's ethical dimensions and humanity's persistence within violence. The 10 aviators of the cabin puff originated from scattered American communities. Hugh Eckenrode operated the tail position until the mission's violence claimed his life at 23 years. 8 persisted. Co-pilot Spencer Luke survived until 1985. Navigator Al Saydock through 2010. Bombardier Robert Andrews until 1996. Flight engineer and turret operator Bertrand Colomb through 2006. Radio operator Richard Pachute existed until 2013. Waist gunner Lloyd Jennings, the final surviving member, through 2016. Ball turret operator Sam Blackford lived to advanced age. Alex Yelisanko survived until 1980. These 8 established complete existences following global conflict. Marriages transpired, offspring appeared, professional paths unfolded, grandchildren materialized, great-grandchildren followed. Conservative calculation suggests Stiegler's merciful decision generated more than 300 descendants presently inhabiting the world, all because one aviator selected compassion above obedience. The damaged bomber ceased operational utility. The cabin puff returned stateside during 1944's spring, eventually dismantled for materials during 1945's final summer. 2019 witnessed a surviving B-17 undergo restoration in the cabin puff's original markings by the Ericsson Aircraft Collection. This resurrected fortress performs at contemporary air exhibitions, permitting modern generations to observe a flying fortress, to contemplate the mercy residing within its restoration. Stigler's choice demanded profound personal sacrifice. Advancement toward the Knight's Cross, Germany's paramount decoration, evaporated. Court-martial loomed as genuine possibility. Execution remained feasible. He disregarded direct command, yet regret never materialized. Questioned subsequently regarding motivation, Stigler's response demonstrated simplicity. His commanding officer's words about honor persisted in memory. He witnessed wounded combatants attempting rescue of compatriots. He recognized absence of threat. His conscience permitted singular response. Brown's own valor proved equally extraordinary. Surrender remained available when mechanical failure rendered the aircraft nearly unflyable. His team had freed him from command responsibility. He declined. A 250-mile oceanic traverse transpired beneath a bomber that should have descended from the sky. His team returned intact through determination alone. Gustav Rodel's instructions to pilots across North Africa about respecting parachuting adversaries represented philosophy seemingly extinct within industrial-scale 20th-century destruction. Yet these lessons, retrieved during crucial junctures, preserved 10 individuals and redirected destinies. The extended classification symbolizes institutional discomfort. Warfare necessitates unambiguous categorization: self and other, righteousness and corruption, brotherhood and opposition. Adversary compassion disrupts these boundaries. Combatants contemplate whether their intended target exists as fundamentally different creature. Brown and Stigler's 1990 reunion facilitated reciprocal healing previously imagined impossible. For Brown, wandering concluded, nightmare haunting terminated. For Stigler, affirmation materialized regarding a decision executed amid jeopardy and endured through silence across nearly 50 years. Relationship transcending warrior identities, surpassing symbolic representation, demonstrated transformation potential. They traversed together. They testified together. Fraternal intimacy exceeded biological connection. When mortality approached one, separation became unbearable. 2008 witnessed deterioration. Franz Stigler departed Vancouver on March 22 at 92. 8 months later, November 24 arrived with Charlie Brown's passing in Miami, age 86. Geographical distance separated their final resting places, though their families comprehended their eternal conjunction. An inscription resided within volumes Stigler had previously gifted Brown, words encapsulating their connection's essence. 1940, Stigler inscribed, "Claimed my brother, a night fighter." December 20, 1943, I preserved a B-17. A pilot identifying as Charlie Brown. This individual matches my brother's irreplaceability. I thank you, Charlie, my brother, Franz. That frozen December afternoon, suspended at 27,000 feet above Germany, presented two adversaries. They separated as beings transcending enmity. 47 years later, they recognized each other as brothers.